Welcome to Roots Interrupted, the podcast where we uncover how colonial policies continue to shape Indigenous lives in Canada. I'm your host, Rachel Odigye. In today's episode, the 60s Scoop Breaking and Rebuilding Indigenous Families, will explore one of the most devastating but lesser understood parts of Canada's colonial history: the large-scale removal of Indigenous children from their families during the 1960s through the 1980s. We'll look at how this policy started, what it did to Indigenous kinships, the personal experiences of those who lived through it, and how the journey toward reconciliation is still unfolding today. Episode 1, A Colonial Continuation, How the 60s Scoop Begun. To understand the 60s Scoop, we first have to understand that it didn't appear out of nowhere. According to James Sinclair in his article, The 60s Scoop and the Colonialization of Indigenous Kinship, the Scoop was the direct continuation of Canada's colonial efforts to destroy Indigenous culture and identity, just under a new name. When residential schools started closing in 1950s and the 1960s, the government didn't stop trying to control Indigenous children. Instead, they transferred that control to the child welfare system. Social workers, often non-Indigenous and unfamiliar with Indigenous cultures, began entering Indigenous homes and removing children at alarming rates. Claire writes that these removals were justified under the claims of neglect, but what was really happening was the colonialization of kinship, the forced replacement of Indigenous family systems with Western ideas of what a proper family looked like. In Indigenous societies, kinship isn't limited to parents and children. It extends to aunts, uncles, elders, and the community members. Everyone has a role in raising and teaching the child. But the government officials didn't see those structures as valid. They saw poverty and cultural difference as failure. Sinclair points out that this misunderstanding of kinship allowed the state to continue its mission of assimilation. In his words, child welfare became the new residential school. By the 1970s, roughly 1 in 4 Indigenous children in Canada had been taken from their homes, most placed with white, middle-class families. These children were given new names, new religion, and new lives, often with no contact from their birth families. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report in 2015 confirms that these actions were part of a larger pattern of cultural genocide, where the state attempted to erase Indigenous identity through policies that tore children from their communities. Episode 2, The Human Cost, Stories from Survivors. It's one thing to know the statistics, but the emotional reality is something else entirely. The CBC Indigenous series, 60 Scoop Survivor Stories, that was conducted in 2017, gives voice to the people who actually lived through it. These stories reveal deep loss, confusion, and trauma that stretched far beyond childhood. One survivor describes being adopted by a white family who told her she should be grateful to have escaped poverty, but she says she always felt like she didn't belong. Not in her new family and not in the world around her. She recalls looking at the mirror and wondering, why do I look different? Why don't I know who I am? Another survivor remembers growing up in a small Ontario town where no one else looked like her. She was told not to talk about being Indigenous, not to ask where she came from. She said, they changed my names, my clothes, my food, and my prayers. They didn't just take me from my family, they took me from myself. The CBC series captures the pain vividly. Many survivors talk about the scoop left them with lasting mental and emotional scars, depression, substance use, and an identity crisis that carried into adulthood. Some survivors did eventually reconnect with their birth families, but the process was rarely simple. Years of separation created cultural and emotional distance that couldn't be erased with a single reunion. One survivor shared that when she finally met her birth mom, she felt both joy and grief. Joy for finding her and grief for all the years lost. These stories bring Sinclair's analysis to life. The colonialization of kinship wasn't abstract. It was experienced through loneliness, shame, and the loss of belonging. Episode 3: Recognition and Reconciliation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission argues that reconciliation begins by acknowledging the harm, not just through apologies, but through action. The TRC identifies the 60s scoop as a direct continuation of earlier assimilation policies. It calls on government to fully support Indigenous-led child welfare systems, ensure children can maintain their language and culture, and give survivors space to share their experiences publicly. In 2017, the federal government issued a formal apology to the 60s scoop survivors. Then Indigenous Relations Ministry, Carol Bennett, stated, "We are sorry for the loss of culture and identity experienced by Indigenous children and families as a result of the 60s scoop." But many survivors said that the apology, while meaningful, could not have been enough on its own. As everyone told CBC, "Words don't bring back the years I lost. I want to see change, real change, in how Indigenous children are treated today." And that demand is powerful. Sinclair emphasizes that reconciliation must include rebuilding kinship systems, not simply restoring old structures, but empowering Indigenous communities to define family and child welfare on its own terms. That means shifting from systems that separate families to ones that support families. It means recognizing that Indigenous children welfare should be led by Indigenous people, grounded in traditional teachings and guided by community care rather than punishment. The 60s Scoops remains a painful reminder that Canada's child welfare system has long been rooted in colonial control. But it's also a story of survival. Despite everything, the loss, the separation, the silence, Indigenous families continue to rebuild themselves and their nations. The TRC reminds us that reconciliation isn't just a one-time event. It's a lifelong process that requires learning, listening, and action. Governments must support Indigenous-led child welfare reforms. Schools must teach this history honestly, and Canadians must commit to understand how systems of colonialization still shape the present. As we close today's episode, I want to leave you with one of the most powerful quotes from Sinclair. "When we restore kinship, we restore the world." Thank you for joining me on this episode of Roots Interrupted. The 60s Scoop is a story of tragedy, but also survival. A reminder that even when systems are designed to erase people, culture, and kinship, can never be truly destroyed.